Hi, I'm Rebecca Williams and I am a lecturer in environmental law here at the University of Glasgow, and I'm one of the programme conveners for the Climate Law and Justice LLM. This mini lecture here today is going to talk a little bit more about climate justice and the sort of things you might be studying here with us at Glasgow as part of your LLM. We all know about climate change and the fact that we are suffering from a very severe climate crisis at the moment. Temperatures globally are rising significantly. We're seeing extreme weather events, droughts, food insecurity, economic disruption, and even political conflict caused by the rising temperatures from increased amounts of greenhouse gas emissions that are being pumped into the atmosphere. But at the same time, we're seeing a real concentration of the worst effects of climate change in the global south and particularly vulnerable global populations. So arguably the time for studying and learning more about climate justice is right now. It's more important than it's ever been before. But we perhaps all have different ideas of what climate justice might be. Perhaps you know a lot about the Fridays for Future movement when school children decided to not attend school because state leaders were not adequately addressing the climate crisis in their policy making. Perhaps you have experienced severe weather events in your home country, or seen perhaps a type of wildlife you knew when you were younger that no longer exists in your natural environment. Here at Glasgow, we're going to start to talk about the sort of legal structures and legal actions that we can take to try and encourage climate justice. Something that's really important when we're thinking about climate justice is to understand why tackling climate change and the climate crisis is such a difficult legal problem. And one of the main reasons that underpins this difficulty that lawmakers and policymakers may have when trying to tackle climate change is the fact that climate change is a transboundary or common resource problem. So when we're looking at climate change mitigation strategies, we have to have global consensus and global action to really truly be tackling climate change. It doesn't matter, for example, say if a country in sub-Saharan Africa is really implementing very effective and impactful climate change mitigation measures, if then when we're looking to more Western and industrialized countries, they're just continuing to emit CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. We really need this collective response, and that makes it a very politically and legally difficult issue to try and address. Another layer of political contention is added when we start to think about factors like who are the historical emitters for greenhouse gas emissions globally. When we think about those who've perhaps contributed to the climate crisis the most, we usually think about more industrialized Western countries. But things can perhaps get a little bit more complicated when we think about countries that are more rapidly industrializing and perhaps now match the levels of emissions that previously greater polluters such as Western or industrialized nations might have done. There's lots of arguments internationally, there's lots of discussions and lots of debates about who is really responsible and who should be fronting the cost of climate change mitigation. No countries particularly want to take really stringent climate change mitigation measures because it is financially costly. It's going to require a shift away from normal society structures, normal economic structures, and it is often a big financial outlay. But at the same time, there are a significant amount of countries in the global south, for example, that are already experiencing the impacts of climate change and the climate crisis. So how can law contribute towards achieving climate justice? How do our current legal systems perhaps contribute towards achieving climate justice, or perhaps even injustices, for example? A way I like to frame this is in the language of Carmen Gonzalez, a wonderful scholar on global south issues related to environmental and climate justice and human rights. And she breaks down this idea of climate justice into 4 different components: distributive justice, procedural justice, corrective justice, and social justice. And these are 4 big concepts that I'm sure you'll be encountering whilst studying for your Climate Law and Justice LLM. And you'll begin to learn some of the different legal strategies and legal policies that are in place to help achieve each of these individual components. So I'll start first by talking about distributive justice. And the idea that underpins this is that when we're thinking about climate change mitigations and perhaps the benefits we do get from emitting greenhouse gas emissions, such as economic growth and human development, actually when we're thinking about climate change and distributive justice, we're meant to be thinking of a fair allocation of the benefits and the burdens of natural resource degradation or use of greenhouse gas emissions. And we want those different effects to be shared equally across different global countries. We run into a lot of issues with regards to distributive justice and climate change because actually a lot of the poorer countries globally and those who perhaps have greater socioeconomic or human development needs are actually bearing the most harm from emissions produced by other wealthier countries. In international climate change law, we do have a number of principles that we use to try and tackle these issues. For example, you'll probably be introduced to the common but differentiated responsibilities principle whilst you're studying for your climate law and justice LLM. So the next aspect of climate justice I want to talk about is this idea of procedural justice. And this essentially is the idea of having very open, informed, and inclusive decision-making processes with regards to environmental or climate legislation, or perhaps also different types of projects that might have negative impacts on the environment. So, for example, when we're thinking about the types of legal processes and strategies that might be able to help with this, we can think about ensuring that there's adequate consultation before perhaps a big development project is introduced, having good access to information, being able to understand exactly what is happening to your environment. Examples could include the amount of greenhouse gas emissions a certain corporation is pumping out. Another really important aspect of procedural justice here is ensuring that you, as an individual, have access to legal review or legal remedies where you think perhaps the law isn't being enforced properly or your own individual rights are being compromised. So within the Climate Law and Justice LLM, we'll begin to introduce you to some of the key pieces of legislation that already exist to ensure some of these rights, for example, the Aarhus Convention, but we'll also begin to think about these broader procedural systems that are in place for general lawmaking and environmental lawmaking, and perhaps some of the voices that go unheard in these processes. The next aspect of climate justice that you will begin to address is this idea of corrective justice. When we're thinking about corrective justice, the idea is that when an environmental harm has occurred, there is some kind of obligation for any inequity that's caused by that to be rectified, and perhaps also measures to be put in place in relation to ensuring that that harm never happens again. So in the legal sense, this is often litigation or perhaps seeking access to judicial review, reparations, damages. And actually there's been a real burgeoning in the amount of climate law related litigation that's been happening in recent years. We've seen a big wave of youth climate-led litigation, but also more broadly, we are seeing the issue of climate change being brought up in a whole range of courts, both internationally and nationally. And these are the kinds of topics you'll be addressing during the process of studying for your LLM, and perhaps also be beginning to learn and gain experience in the types of legal strategies utilised by lawyers to be able to further this idea of climate and corrective climate justice. The final aspect of climate justice that we really do delve into in the programme is this idea of social climate justice. It's an area that I'm particularly passionate about, and essentially we try and understand that the environmental struggles that we are seeing globally are very much intertwined with similar struggles for social and economic justice. This idea that climate justice can't be separated from economic equality, race and gender subordination, and also the colonial dynamics and post-colonial domination that we do often see in the global south from global north producers and state actors. In the Climate Law and Justice LLM, this will be a real focus of your studies. We will not be separating the idea of environmental struggles away from socioeconomic struggles. For example, if you decide to take the Fundamentals of Environmental Justice course with me as part of the LLM program, we'll be addressing environmental law and environmental issues from a lot of different, usually marginalized perspectives. So, for example, we'll be covering Global South scholarship in relation to environmental issues, race, gender, queer ecology, disability climate justice. And these are some of the core and key perspectives that you will gain from studying the Climate Law and Justice program. So I hope this has given you a good taste of what you might be studying in the Climate Law and Justice LLM. As you can tell, it's a really interesting area of study. It's something that I care really passionately about, and I hope that you will too.